who was Minnesota's first geologist. And there's a trail on the west side of the Mississippi between Franklin and 40th, 42nd Street that that I run on frequently. So I'm very curious to hear more about this person, and I think she'll talk about why it's named for him. And well, something I learned this morning is Sue is an avid birder. Her background is in biology, and obviously she's a writer, writes on environmental topics as well as write books. But she's an avid birder, and when she was 7 years old, this all started when she was 7. She got a Bible and a bird guide from her parents as a gift. So with that, I am going to have Sue start off.
Do you want to see my face? I'm not sure how to do that. I clicked on, well, I'm just going to share my, oh, that's not good. Should not, okay. I know, can you guys see me?
Yes, we can see you, but we can also see your email or someone's email.
Yeah, why is that?
I think you clicked on that tab.
Okay, let's just start with the screen. Here's our hero.
There you go.
This is my show. You can see my show, not my face, right?
Yes, that's right.
Okay, is it full screen?
Nope.
Try that. Play from start. Yeah.
They're perfect.
Good?
Yes.
Okay. So, hi everybody. I wish I could see you. I'm really sorry we're not in person. I'm this darn pandemic. But I'm going to tell you today the story of Newton Horace Winchell, an early Minnesota geologist based at the University of Minnesota. He was hired by the state to identify and map out rocks that underlie Minnesota's surface. In my book, I often refer to Winchell as having the geological eye. I myself in my younger years was aware that some people, like my husband, could identify geological features of a landscape just by looking at it. And he could see things I couldn't see. So let's start out with, what do you see when you look at this picture? Where do you think it was taken? Doesn't it look like the Boundary Waters? It's actually not. It's taken only a few miles from my house. It's the St. Croix River between Taylor's Falls and Osceola. It looks like the Boundary Waters because those are basalt outcrops, and the St. Croix River shares a geology with the Lake Superior region. Over 1 billion years ago, a crack opened up in the earth, a feature called the Mid-Continental Rift, and molten rock from volcanoes spilled out, forming the rocks of the North Shore, the Boundary Waters, and the Dalles of the St. Croix. The rift runs under the surface now, mostly hidden. It extends all the way from Lake Superior, which it forms the basin of the lake, to Nebraska. Now I'll tell you a non-geological secret about this picture. On one of these rocks, there are barely discernible pictographs left by ancient peoples. Okay, next chance at having a geological eye. What do you see when you look at this photo? Is it merely a very pretty little river or the remains of ancient seabeds? This is the Kickapoo River that runs through the driftless area of southwestern Wisconsin. Those are limestone beds that once were the floor of a great inland sea, 400 million years ago. If you were to look closely, you might see the remains of tiny shells of sea creatures that inhabited those seas. But that's not the only interesting thing in this picture. If you look closely at the base of the cliff where it meets the water, you'll see a fringe of green. Those are mosses and liverworts that cling to the rocks trying to keep a toehold. These two types of plants are in competition for the surface, and each are affected differently when the river rises after a rainfall. If you're familiar with Robin Wall Kimmerer, the author of Braiding Sweetgrass, you may know that she is a trained botanist with a PhD from Madison, Wisconsin. She did her thesis work on these plants on the Kickapoo. A geological eye is in part what you choose to look at. Newton Horace Winchell was born in New York State in 1839 along its border with Connecticut. He was the fifth of 8 children. The Winchell family had been in the area for several generations, and a mountain was named after the family. This is the view from Winchell Mountain, looking towards the Catskills. Newton's parents were both school teachers. They were well educated and demonstrably intelligent, but the family did not have a lot of money. Newton's father, Horace, was brilliant in a quirky way. When Newton was a child, Horace spent a lot of time with him in nature with school books, a good example of an educator teaching his child. But his quirkiness hardened. By the time Newton was a teen, Horace became convinced that the end of the world was in sight and backed up his belief with numerous intellectual writings. Consumed by this non-paying work, he no longer brought in money and the family was bordering on destitution. It was Caroline Winchell, pictured here, who staved off poverty. As a married woman, she could no longer teach, but she took in boarders. She taught homemakers a way to alter clothing for their families and ran a millinery business out of her home. She was the first, but not the last, of strong, capable women in Newton's life. Newton was mortified by his father's behavior and developed a plan in his early teens to escape the family's chaotic situation. But he needed money to carry out his plan, which was primarily to get an education and a good paying job. So naturally, he turned to school teaching and took a post at a one-room schoolhouse similar to the one pictured here. He was only 15, but this job and a series of short-term jobs like it had a deep influence on him. As a school teacher, he taught 5 levels of reading, writing, arithmetic, algebra, geography, and oratory. School teachers had a broad base of knowledge, the ability to control and educate many different kinds of students at the same time, and often had administrative skills. These would all serve Newton well in his future. With his salary, Newton helped his mother pay the bills. He bought a decent set of clothes and a train ticket to Ann Arbor, Michigan. He was like 17. Newton's oldest brother, Alexander, taught a variety of scientific courses at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. Now, Michigan is only 2 buildings, so it's also beginning as an institution. Alexander had also benefited from his father's attention, but had left home before Horace went down the rabbit hole of. And a second older brother, Martin, were confidants to the young Newton, and both were adamant that he needed to leave home and make his own way in the world. Here's Alexander, his college-educated wife. Remember, this is like 1859. His college-educated wife, she was a music major, and their 2 daughters, Jenny and Ida Bell, on her mother's lap. Jenny would become a vocalist, an opera singer. The photo was taken a couple years after Newton arrived in Ann Arbor. Newton adored his nieces and often mentions them in the journal he kept at the time. This photo has a darker side, though. At the time it was taken, the Winchells had already lost 2 children to illness and would lose 2 more. The daughters pictured here are the only children of Alexander's that would grow to adulthood, and this was a tragedy that haunted Newton for the rest of his life. Alexander was a rising star in Ann Arbor. Newton came in time just in time to help Alexander's family move into a new house. You can see it at the top of the page. It's an octagon house, the forerunner of the geodesic dome, showing that Alexander was a creative, out-of-the-box type thinker. Alexander was in charge of the Michigan Geological Survey and spent his summers in the field. In 1860, Newton was, at age 20, was served as the survey's botanist. He had 0 botanical training and taught himself how to identify plants by keen specimens using Asa Gray's now classic manual of botany. Keying out plants is no easy task. That Newton mastered it is an early indication of his meticulous mind and his doggedness. Perpetually in need of money, Newton alternately took college courses and taught in public schools to fund his education. He spent a good deal of his evenings teaching himself material he couldn't take at school. Now in his 20s, his school duties expanded. He taught himself German and French. He had already knew Latin and Greek. He taught natural history, which we would call physics today, and astronomy and music. At the large high school in St. Clair, Michigan, Newton was a co-principal with Charlotte Imus, a college grad with a very good mind. Newton fell head over heels in love with the intellectual, idealistic young woman, and I have seen the letters to prove it. And they married in 1864. That is Lottie, the second from the left at the top. The photo is actually of the Albion College faculty in 1860. Lottie was an Albion grad, and at 22 had been hired back to teach at her alma mater. After marriage, Winchell supported the family with a succession of teaching jobs and seasonal geological field work, but teaching was not lucrative and the hours are long. Newton finally came to the decision that he wanted to do what Alex was doing, field geology. By this time, there were 3 little children in the family, 2 little children, Horty and Ima. In 1872, Newton was offered a job to head up the Minnesota Geological and Natural History Survey. The state legislature enacted the legislation of the survey, but the job offer came from William Watts Falwell, the president of the university, who had lobbied hard for the opportunity to choose the new geologist. This meant that the Board of Regents, not the politicians, were in charge of supervising the survey, which made the funding less capricious and it set the tone of the survey as more scientific than economic. The survey was actually 3 jobs. First of all, a survey of all the rocks, animals, and plants in the entire state, teaching the science classes at the U, and setting up and running a natural history museum, that was to display what the survey found. And this natural history museum would morph into today's Bell Museum. Falwell, which is shown here, was only 7 years older than Winchell, so these guys were in their 30s. Falwell was like 39, Winchell was 32. The position paid $1,000 a year, not a lot of money, but more than Winchell had ever earned, and it gave him job security for the next 20 years. This is what the university looked like when Winchell arrived in 1872. It was housed in one building, Old Main, shown here. Old Main was built of blue limestone quarried on nearby Spirit Island near Nicollet Island, and the building was located in the University Knoll, where Shevlin Hall is today. Winchell had rooms on the 3rd floor of Old Main, and the museum was located adjacent to his offices. There was also an auditorium seating 1,000 people on the 3rd floor. Every day, the entire student body and staff trudged up to the 3rd floor for chapel before starting classes. Whatever happened to Old Main? Well, it went up in flames in 1904. What did Newton's survey entail? The Minnesota survey was unusual for a state survey in several respects. First of all, as mentioned, it was headquartered at the state's chief educational institution, the university. Second of all, it was very specific. The legislators were very specific in what they wanted from their state geologists. First, it required maps showing the bedrock of all 87 counties. It wanted to know if there was building stone available, because some areas like southwestern Minnesota didn't have any trees to build frame buildings. It was instructed to look for sources of fuel. Iowa had just discovered peat deposits to burn. Did Minnesota have anything like that? They wanted to know if there were ores like gold, iron, or silver to exploit. Where in the state would farming be most successful? Hence, they wanted to know the rainfall patterns. And lastly, and most open-endedly, anything in Minnesota life that begged scientific assessment, Winchell claimed for the survey. And for this reason, the conundrum of the grasshopper plagues of the 1870s came to be investigated by the survey. It seemed like an overwhelming job, but Winchell was young and had boundless energy. Winchell and Lottie and their little family of 3, baby Avis had been born in November 1871, arrived in Minneapolis in late summer and rented a house in the Dinkytown neighborhood of southeast Minneapolis. Many professors lived in the neighborhood and adjacent Marcy homes. The neighborhood was new, and many of the bur oaks remaining from the original oak savanna graced the yards and the university campus. Some of these oaks can still be seen today, trees that were original from the native savanna, trees that no human hand planted. And there are still oak savanna trees downtown Minneapolis. And Winchell student T.S. Roberts mentions seeing passenger pigeons on some of these oak savanna trees in his lifetime. Winchell was not assigned to teach classes that first term, so he delved right into survey work. The first thing he did was visit Winona on a train, where he was looking at rock outcrops and quarries, river valleys and waterfalls. He talked to Professor Phelps at the normal school, which was already up and running and turning out teachers. Phelps had a terrific trilobite collection. He looked at William Hurlbut, who was a former mayor of Rochester. Hurlbut was an amateur geologist and had very useful insight for Newton. Newton then took a train to Stillwater, took a look at the courthouse, which is still standing, and then traveled up the St. Croix River Valley and spent the night at the Chisago House in Taylor's Falls before taking the stagecoach back to the train tracks. After 3 months on the job, including 2 months in the field, he produced a 129-page report. The first one included a map. You could tell he was a teacher when you read through that first annual report. It has his impulse to instruct the Board of Regents. He laid out 2 very basic tenets. First, that the natural laws that apply today also applied in the past. This was not a given in the popular mind. And more importantly is that the age of the earth isn't 6,000 years. It's much, much older than that. Time is immense. And so there's a lot of time present to allow these vast geological changes to take place. He aimed to link Minnesota with the rest of the world. So he had a field season in 1873, the very next summer, and they collected a lot of stuff, but Old Main was undergoing expansion because the student population was growing so fast. So he really didn't have lab space in which to analyze what he had collected. He didn't have any chemistry lab to analyze the rocks as was laid out in the legislation. So he was at a kind of a dilemma. Out of the blue, he was offered a position as geologist to accompany General George Armstrong Custer on an expedition to the Black Hills. Officially, this expedition was to explore a territory that had been ceded to the Lakota in an 1868 treaty. Unofficially, it was to look for gold. Winchell was to be the official geologist, and he had an assistant, but Custer also invited 2 miners to come along to look for the precious metal. Winchell had access to Custer, and you would have thought the 2 would have hit it off. They were nearly identical in age, both being born in December 1839. Both men had grown up poor and clawed their way up to some semblance of social status. Both men had married Michigan farm girls. Both men had ties to southeastern Michigan. But a friendship didn't happen, and after 1874, Winchell never mentioned Custer in any letters or papers that I had access to. Why was this? My guess is that the 2 men were utterly different. Custer was everything Winchell was not. Flashy, mercurial, a braggart. Winchell was stolid, careful, circumspect. I'm thinking that the 2 did not get on, and that Winchell maybe was even wary of Custer. There were several well-documented stories of incidents that occurred on the expedition involving Custer, that he shot a scout, that he set fire to the grass around his brother's tent because the brother had overslept. Such deeds probably unsettled Winchell and caused him to give the general wide berth. Now here's what this expedition in 1874 looked like. It was immense. It had 951 soldiers, 100 wagons, each pulled by 6 mules, and 16 brass band musicians riding white horses that provided, the musicians provided dinner entertainment each night for the general. Winchell took geological notes on southwestern Dakota, collected mammals for the university's Natural History Museum, and a mistake of colossal proportion did not find gold in the Black Hills. Why did our hero not find gold? The gold was discovered by one of the miners. Winchell himself did not find it, and he had a policy never to support a finding unless he could personally verify it. There were rumors that the miners had planted the gold, faking a discovery, though I have not read that this was verified. And we know now that there was indeed gold in the Black Hills. Winchell was vilified in the local press, in the national newspapers, and by Custer himself personally by stating publicly he could not vouch for the certainty of gold. It was a public humiliation for the young geologist who prided himself on his careful methods. That may be one reason that he never mentioned the excursion in later years. 2 years later, of course, Custer and his men would meet untimely ends at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. Many of the men killed in that battle were along on the 1874 excursion, and Winchell undoubtedly knew some of them. I never read any Winchell comment on that historic event either, and maybe his inclination towards fairness made him silent because of it. Okay, 1875, Winchell was at work on the geology of Hennepin County and turning his attention to what was likely the most important issue facing a young Minnesota. St. Anthony Falls, the only major waterfall on the Mississippi River, and the feature powering the economy of Minneapolis was not stable, and everybody knew this. The waterfalls provided the power to run the sawmills and the flour mills that fueled the state's growth. And yet, people could see that pieces of the limestone ledge that the water flowed over kept breaking off, and the waterfalls crept upstream at a noticeable rate. When the falls reached the end of this limestone layer, there would no longer be a sharp drop. The falls would be reduced to a rapids, and Minneapolis would lose its source of power. So the questions for Winchell, the geologist, were, how far up the river does the limestone ledge extend? And how fast is St. Anthony Falls receding upstream? In other words, how much time do we have until we don't have a waterfall? People knew that St. Anthony Falls was fragile. There were islands in the river that didn't move, even as the waterfalls was moving. And people could see the change in the fall's distance from these islands. Before Winchell had arrived in Minneapolis, entrepreneurs had tried to tunnel under the falls to wring one last watt of power out of the cascade, and the ledge had started to crumble. Dozens of mills already clung to the sides of the river like barnacles. The rushing rolled into turbines. Some of these traces can still be seen along the banks of the Mississippi today. People sought a permanent fix to save the falls. A lasting solution took years, an intervention by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, which built an apron capping the falls in 1880. That's why the falls looks like it does today and not a wild waterfall. Winchell was consultant to the Corps. One of the reasons the permanent fix took so long in coming was this. It's going to be expensive. City officials proposed selling bonds to finance the project, but citizens were incensed that the city would take on public debt to rescue privately owned companies. Now, doesn't that sound familiar? But back to the question of how fast the falls was receding. Since the 1600s, there had been eyewitness accounts, maps, and drawings of the falls and the island near them. Nicollet Island was the biggest, but there's also Boom Island, Spirit Island, which had the quarry, Upton Island, and tiny Cataract Island. Father Hennepin left the first account in 1680, and there were others, including eyewitnesses still living when Winchell was there, who told him, when I first came in the 1840s, the falls were at this distance from, say, Spirit Island. People started tinkering with the rate of flow to power mills in 1856, so dates after that time could not be used to calculate a natural rate of recession. But from these accounts, Winchell calculated that the rate of recession, how fast the ledge was breaking off, from 1680 to 1856 was 5.5 feet per year. That's the rate at which the falls were receding upstream. But Winchell was interested in a bigger question. He reasoned that these observations could also tell him how long it was since the glaciers retreated. Here's what he thought. He knew that the top layer of limestone was not continuous. He proposed that before the last glacier, the ancient Mississippi flowed around the western edge of this limestone, taking the path of least resistance, and cut a channel that became the valley of Bassett Creek and continuing to what is now Brownie Lake, and then the chain of lakes. So this valley, Bassett Creek to Brownie Creek to the chain of lakes, is the original valley of the Mississippi River. But when the last glacier approached from the northwest, a secondary lobe of ice thrust northeast up towards Chisago County, shoving glacial till into the Mississippi's channel. This pushed the river out of its valley and forced it to meander. The water continued to rise as the glacier melted, and finally the water plunged over the limestone ledge, meeting the even older Minnesota River at about Fort Snelling, the place that the Dakota called Badote. Fort Snelling then was where the falls first formed, and that represented the end of the glacial ice age. Okay, so now Winchell had what he needed to know. If you think about how you calculate your rate of speed in a car, it's in miles per hour. Winchell knew the rate. He knew the distance between the falls and Fort Snelling. So using those two numbers, he could calculate the time since the last ice age ended. He calculated it as about 8,202 years. Now, Winchell had a math mind. He had once avoided taking a college math test by solving an assigned problem ahead of the test. But a lot of math just involves logic, clear reasoning, and that's what this calculation is. It's really simple math. You just had to have a logical mind. But nobody else had thought to do this or use these observations to calculate the retreat of the glaciers. People were amazed at how recent it was since the glaciers had retreated. Only 8,000 years. Today, we estimate the retreat of the last glaciers to be about 12,000 years. So Winchell was very, very accurate. After he presented his work, and his paper was read internationally as well, geologists turned their attention to the rate of recession of Niagara Falls. Winchell was lauded throughout the world, and this is one of the discoveries he is best known for. And this is what caused a trail along the west bank of the Mississippi to be called the Winchell Trail. I have some daguerreotypes of the unfettered Mississippi from 1851 before the mills were erected on the river. Here's one showing two of the islands with falls off in the distance on the right-hand side. This one shows the East Channel and buildings along Main Street. This is St. Anthony, Maine of today. Hennepin Island was in this area and has since merged with the mainland. And of course, we still have Boom Island, Spirit Island, Cataract Island, and Eagle Island. All were destroyed by the Army Corps of Engineers when they put in the Upper Lock and Dam. Okay, but let's switch back to Lottie. Here she is. At home with 4 children, ages 10, 9, 4, and 2. The family had moved into a house that had once been the old Cheever Hotel with 18 rooms. The Winchells bought the hotel and then moved it with the help of friends to a lot on State Street, about where Walter Library is today on the University Mall. They planted trees, dug a garden, built a barn. As the kids grew up and entered the university, the house became a meeting place for young people. Several of the kids were married in the house, babies were born here, and many workers on the Geological Survey were housed here. Lottie was in charge of the household, and in 1876, she was approached by local politicians with feminist leanings to run for school board for the East Minneapolis district. She ran with another woman, another Charlotte Van Cleve, as in Van Cleve Park in Minneapolis, Southeast Minneapolis, and both women won. The legislature had recently enacted a law that allowed women to run for school board positions and to vote in them. So it was kind of a setup. The politicians that wanted to see women be allowed to vote introduced the legislation in a very narrow way You can run for school board, you can vote in school board elections, and they knew women that they wanted to ask to run. Lottie was well qualified. She was a college grad, a former teacher, and a parent with kids in the district. And of course, she was an ardent proponent of women's right to vote. The local paper carried an article on her first school board meeting, and of course, it had to describe what the women wore. Lottie clipped the article and saved it. I know this because the clipping is in the Winchell papers at the History Center in St. Paul. The University of Minnesota was a driver of these progressive ideas. Before the vote, women held a caucus to drum up attention and support. It was attended by many professors' wives, and the wife of the sitting governor, who lived in Southeast Minneapolis, Mahala Fisk Pillsbury, spoke to the attendees. At that first meeting, Lottie, who was particularly interested in libraries, and she wanted to know how the school library was funded. Several years earlier, she had started a library in Adrian, Michigan, when the family lived there, a legacy to her that is still in existence today. Okay, so Winchell has now mapped southern Minnesota, southeastern Minnesota, and Hennepin County. But in 1878, the legislature directed Winchell to the North Shore. There had been an interest in the possibility of iron ore deposits there. In fact, they had found them. They had also found gold near Lake Vermilion, and there was a premature and not very successful gold rush. But now they were wanting to look at iron ore, and Winchell assembled a crew of 4, took the train to Duluth, bought a small boat, and camped out by the mouth of Chester Creek while they began surveying. This picture is from his fourth report of the Geology of Minnesota, the final report. During the summer months, the crew sailed along the shoreline. There was no road running between Duluth and Grand Portage, and this is 1 year before John Beargrease began his mail route. His father was actually doing the mail route on the water during the summer months. There was a large Ojibwe settlement in Grand Portage, and there was a settlement in Duluth, and then pretty much nothing else, although the Ojibwe spent the summer near Beaver Bay. This is Palisade Head, which Winchell sampled at the foot and then also climbed up and sampled at the top. They also visited Gooseberry Falls, the Baptist and Temperance Rivers, and collected barrels of Thompsonite bearing rocks at Thompsonite Beach. Weirdly, when they were near where Lutsen is today, they were blown ashore by fierce winds, and while beached, experienced a total eclipse of the sun, which they were not prepared for. Winchell named the bay Eclipse Bay, but it didn't stick. Then at the end of the summer, the survey split into 2 teams. One team revisited spots along the shore. This team was headed by Christopher Hall, a university professor, who tried out an experimental collapsible canoe on the Devil Track River and Devil's Track Lake. The other team consisted only of Winchell and 2 Ojibwe guides hired from Grand Portage to survey the international border between the United States and Canada. Winchell traveled in a bona fide birch bark canoe purchased from the Indians and carried by the guides over the numerous portages the crew took in the next 6 weeks. This photo shows the canoe in front of Pillsbury Hall. It's actually still in existence. It's owned by the Minnesota Historical Society. And a reader told me that he's seen it suspended from the ceiling at the Science Museum in St. Paul. At least he saw a full-size birch bark canoe there. And because of the pandemic, I haven't been down to check it out. This book came out in the first year of the pandemic, and then it won the book award in the second year of the pandemic. Gosh, it's been a long time. Ojibwe canoes, standard ones, tend to be between 16 and 18 feet like the ones we use today. They're exquisite craft, lightweight and maneuverable, really the only watercraft one could imagine Winchell using on this trip. And he could not have made this trip without his Ojibwe guides because the Boundary Waters lakes had not been mapped. That was part of his job. And were too complicated, which he mentions in a letter back home to Lottie. This is Burnside Lake, and the picture was taken by his brother Alexander in the 1880s when they came back to do some more work in the boundary waters. At Big Basswood Lake, the team headed away from the border towards what would become the town of Ely. So they're portaging all the way from the border lakes to Ely. There was no iron ore mines at the time, but they would be there in 4 years or less, based on what Winchell is finding right now. Then they portaged into Lake Vermilion to explore out the mines, which would be near Tower. This is the Vermilion Range. And then they made their way to the Embarrass River in the Mesabi Iron Belt, where Winchell noted the iron deposits were close to the surface and probably could be mined in open pits. Then they portaged into the St. Louis River, paddled up the East Savannah River, and lastly took the Savannah Portage, another fantastic portage, equally famous and equally notorious. You know, they had begun with the Grand Portage, away from Grand Portage up to the Pigeon River, where they paddled then to Aiken and Winchell could catch a train home. It was late October and the lakes were beginning to freeze. Snow was in the air. Winchell had a reputation among the Ojibwe as being physically tough. They said he could traverse rough terrain all day and sleep all night with his feet to the fire and a rock for a pillow. I have got to believe that this reputation first took hold on this epic canoe trip. Okay, now this is a natural stopping point. Should I keep going?
I think it would actually be good to, well, a few more minutes. How about that? There's just one question, and it's not a rush.
Okay.
You know.
Well, you want to tell me, Rebecca, when you want me to stop?
Yeah, I will.
Okay, so this is the natural inflection point of the survey. Winchell now hires an assistant, Warren Upham, who had a PhD in glacier geology from Dartmouth. And he was assigned to map the counties that were covered by glacial till. He boarded with the Winchells at 120 State Street when he wasn't in the field. He came to Minnesota as an unmarried young man, but he was in the field a lot. In his first year, traveled 3,300 miles by horse and cart, if you can imagine, assessing rock outcroppings along rivers and streams, looking at well borings, and examining soil characteristics. He would become like a third son to Winchell, and without getting too far ahead of myself, he would be instrumental in helping Winchell in Winchell's encore career. Upham worked for the Canadian Survey after his work in Minnesota. He especially concentrated his efforts on the Red River Valley, which is the site of Glacial Lake Agassiz, which his work leads us gives us our understanding of the formation of lakes in the Minnesota region today. He had a second career in the Minnesota Historical Society, where he was a secretary for many years. You may recognize his name from his landmark book, Place Names of Minnesota, which is still in print today. In fact, when people talk about Warren Upham, they don't talk about geology, they talk about place names of Minnesota. This brings us to the 1880s, a time that like no other in Minnesota history. To set our geological story in context, you should know that both the Washburn-Crosby flour mill, which would become General Mills, and the Pillsbury mill had undergone mutual expansions, switching to steel rollers from millstones. The farmers of the state had broken the prairie sod and were producing huge quantities of wheat for these mills. The Washburn-Crosby company sent William Dunwoody to Europe to open up the European markets. Minneapolis doubled in size from 1880 to 1883, up to 90,000 people now. Flour was the king in the mill city. If one looks at a city directory at the time, which lists occupation, it's just truly astonishing how many residents had jobs connected with the flour mills. Money was flowing into Minneapolis. This is when the big mansions began appearing, like Summit Avenue and the 10th and Harmon neighborhood, which is, of course, not a residential neighborhood anymore. And during this boom, Winchell too was hitting his stride. He released his first volume of his final report to the legislature, one covering southern Minnesota. There would ultimately be 6 volumes. He helped organize the first American professional journal devoted solely to geology. He and his brother Alexander were instrumental in forming the Geological Society of America in 1888, which is still the society to which most working geologists belong. And in 1889, he got his science hall, Pillsbury Hall. So, yes.
Great. Thank you, Sue. So,
Why don't I get out of here? You can see me.
This is fascinating to me, as I worked for the U.S. Geological Survey for
You're kidding.
a good decade. Yeah.
Really?
So, and just realizing, what influence he had on geology as a profession. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
So this is a question from Myra. She was raised in South Dakota, so she was aware of the Homestake gold mine in the Black Hills.
Oh yeah.
And that there's a engineering school near the mine called the School of Mines and Technology, and one of her brothers happened to attend. But she's wondering, since Minnesota's geologist was recruited to assess minerals in the Black Hills, she's guessing South Dakota didn't have a geologist, at least not at that time. And then that leads her to the question of how common was it at that time for states to have geologists? And do most or maybe all states have their own geologists?
Well, first of all, at the time, South Dakota, the Dakotas weren't states. It was a territory. And the treaty had ceded half of the Dakotas to the Lakota. So there wouldn't have been a geologist working for the state of South Dakota in that area. In fact, an earlier geologist, F.W. Hayden, had gone to the area to do some mapping, but he hadn't entered the Black Hills because the Lakota didn't want him to. It was their secret site, and he honored that. At the time Minnesota set up its geological survey, that was the golden age of the geological surveys in the Midwestern part of the area. So Iowa had a geological survey. Wisconsin's geological survey was occurring at about the same time, maybe a little bit earlier. But it wasn't, most of them were not as comprehensive as Minnesota's, because Minnesota took in natural history as well.
And then Tom wanted to know, what was the relationship of Winchell and the native peoples who populated the areas beyond individual relationships?
I did not read anything about other than the personal contact that Winchell made with the people. I honestly can't say that there was, that he met with tribal leaders. That never happened. Winchell, from an early age, was really interested in the native people that he encountered. He kept a journal when he was on the Geological Survey for Michigan. And so he was 20. And he came across a mission, a Jesuit mission, and which is, I think the community is still in existence since it would be northwestern Lower Peninsula. And he was just not impressed. Well, of course, he was a Protestant, but he's not impressed by the Catholics and their attitude towards the young women that they were supposedly training in this mission. He did keep a list of Anishinaabe words in the back of his journal and their meanings, so spelling and meaning, so he could start to learn the language. Mm-hmm. And when the survey was in the Boundary Waters area, the lakes that they put on their maps were the native names as best they could acquire them from their guides. I will say, for those of you who are familiar with the Boundary Waters, if you go into the Boundary Waters from Fall Lake, you have to go through a little Newton Lake to get into Pipestone Bay of Basswood, and that was named by Alexander for Newton Winchell. And then there is a Winchell Lake, also named for Newton, and an Ima Lake named for his oldest daughter.
So when you said that they tried to name as close as they could to native names, but they were translated into English.
Some of them were, and some of them were, like the Kawishiri River.
Hmm.
That's an Anishinaabe name.
Yeah, it seems like
Shagawa.
rivers kept their original names more likely than lakes.
And then some of them were translated like Knife Lake, was where there was flint
Hmm.
to sharpen knives.
Okay. Um, I think that's it for questions. One thing that you happen to mention that I'm now curious about is how musical his family was.
Yeah. He first mentions the musicality in a journal he was keeping as a teenager when he was like 15, 16. They didn't have a lot of money, but they did have a piano. His sisters and his mother all played. And he said they would often, both parents sang, had nice voices, and they would have little family sings. He would call them sings in the evenings before he went to bed.
Yeah.
So that was the first indication that he was used to using his voice. But when he moved to Michigan, his brother Alexander and his sister-in-law Julia belonged to the choir at the Episcopalian Methodist Church in Ann Arbor, and he joined the choir. And so that family was all singing. And like I said, that one daughter became an opera singer, but the little girl on the lap actually became a daughter-in-law of Newton. She married his oldest son. And she also had a spectacular voice and played the piano. And she was in high demand as a soloist in Minneapolis when she and Horty lived in town. So then Newton comes to Minneapolis. He joins the choir at First Methodist Church, which was in southeastern Minneapolis, southeast Minneapolis. It no longer is in existence. His son Horty performed in musicals, sang solos, and also sang duets with his wife, Ida Bell Winchell, the little girl on the lap. The daughter Ava accompanied them frequently. And his youngest daughter, I don't know about Louise's voice, but Louise was the grandmother to the woman who just died, who sang with the Dale Worland Singers. Margie Ankeny, her obituary is in the Star Tribune this morning.
Thanks for mentioning that. Well, I think we should wrap up. Thank you so much for being part of our Sunday forum and teaching us, letting us know more about this historical figure and the influence that he had on